Karen had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade, and during that time she had made it her mission to ensure that every single rule of the HOA was followed to the letter. She was known for her frequent complaints about minor infractions that most people wouldn't even notice. Her obsession with control had earned her the nickname HOA Karen among the neighbors. It wasn't that she was a bad person, just someone who thrived on enforcing rules at every possible opportunity, and she never hesitated to remind people of her position within the community. One afternoon, as the protagonist was preparing to head out for a much-needed weekend trip, Karen appeared at the front door with an air of urgency and authority that immediately raised suspicion. Karen wasn't one to show up unannounced unless something was afoot. The protagonist had seen her before as she made her rounds through the neighborhood wielding her clipboard as though she were the neighborhood sheriff, but this time it felt different. There was a certain edge to her voice as she knocked on the door. With a forceful tap, the protagonist opened the door, expecting a casual exchange, but was met with Karen's stern face and piercing eyes. Karen wasted no time with pleasantries, jumping straight into her request. Without giving the protagonist a chance to respond, she demanded access to their driveway for what she claimed was an emergency HOA project that had to be completed immediately without explanation or prior warning. Her tone was so commanding that it felt as though it was an order rather than a request. Karen mentioned some vague improvement project that the HOA had supposedly initiated in the area, but the protagonist was taken aback at the lack of details and the sheer audacity of her demand. The protagonist took a step back, trying to process what Karen had just said. It was one thing for Karen to be a stickler for rules, but to demand access to someone's private property without any prior communication or consent was crossing a line. The protagonist quickly asked for clarification. What exactly is this project, and why does it require access to my driveway? They asked, trying to remain calm, but their suspicion growing with every passing second. Karen's response was as abrupt as her entrance. She explained that the HOA needed to do something about the driveway in front of the house, something about resurfacing or widening it for neighborhood access. The protagonist immediately felt uncomfortable with this explanation. The driveway was clearly private property, and there had been no prior notices sent out about any such project in the area. The protagonist's mind raced as they tried to piece everything together. They had received no letters from the HOA, no emails, no announcements at the monthly HOA meetings, nothing that would indicate any such project was in the works. The more Karen spoke, the less sense her words seemed to make, and the protagonist found themselves growing more and more suspicious. Karen pressed on, demanding once again that the driveway be cleared so the work could begin. The protagonist shook their head, still trying to wrap their mind around the situation. This was not normal, not in the slightest. The HOA didn't have the right to just show up and start commandeering private property at will, did it? With a forced smile, the protagonist replied, I'm not sure what this is about, but this driveway is private property, and I don't remember receiving anything about an HOA project. Karen's face hardened, and she raised her voice just slightly as though trying to intimidate the protagonist into submission. The HOA has every right to access any property for community improvements. We've done this before, and this is no different, she asserted, as if the sheer repetition of her words would somehow make them true. The protagonist stood firm, not backing down. This was their home, and they would not let Karen's overreach go unchallenged. But they also knew they had to handle the situation carefully. Karen wasn't someone who would back down easily. The protagonist politely declined her request and told Karen that they would need more information before allowing anyone onto their property. Karen scoffed at the refusal, but the protagonist stood their ground for a moment. It seemed like the confrontation might escalate, but then Karen gave a sharp nod and walked away without saying another word, leaving the protagonist standing at the door with a sense of unease and confusion slowly creeping in. The protagonist stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the spot where Karen had just been, wondering what had just happened. They felt a mix of confusion and irritation wash over them as they processed the exchange. Karen had been so certain, so sure that she had the right to demand access to their driveway, and yet everything about it felt wrong. The more the protagonist thought about it, the more they realized how little sense Karen's actions made. No one had mentioned any sort of project, not the HOA president, not the neighbors, not even the maintenance workers who occasionally came around for yard work. There had been no prior notice, no signs posted, nothing to indicate that this emergency project was anything more than a poorly thought out excuse to get what she wanted. The protagonist glanced down at the spot where Karen had stood a few moments ago and felt a knot form in their stomach. They had heard stories about Karen's overzealous enforcement of the HOA rules, but they had never expected to be on the receiving end of one of her demands. They felt like they were in some kind of strange standoff with someone who was determined to make their life more difficult simply because they could. It wasn't the first time the protagonist had dealt with HOA issues, but it was the first time it had been so personal, so intrusive. The thought of someone just showing up and claiming rights to their property without explanation made their blood boil. As the day wore on, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done about Karen's overreach. They weren't just going to let this slide, they needed to find out what their rights were and what could be done to stop Karen from pulling this stunt again. After all, if Karen was willing to cross these boundaries once, what was stopping her from doing it again in the future? The protagonist sat down at their kitchen table and grabbed their phone. They thought about calling a few neighbors to see if anyone else had been approached by Karen, but then they remembered something more pressing. They needed to know the legal side of things. They needed to understand their rights before Karen tried anything further. After a few quick searches online, the protagonist found a local law firm that specialized in property rights and homeowner association disputes. They were relieved to see that the firm had a consultation available later that afternoon. They wasted no time calling and scheduling an appointment as soon as possible. The law firm's receptionist answered promptly and was understanding of the urgency in the protagonist's voice. They scheduled a consultation for a couple of hours later, and the protagonist hung up feeling slightly more at ease. They knew it wasn't going to be easy, but at least they would have someone on their side who knew how to navigate the complexities of HOA regulations. As the hours passed, the protagonist couldn't help but replay the conversation with Karen in their head over and over again. She had been so insistent and so certain of her position that it made the protagonist doubt themselves for a moment. Was there something they were missing? Was it possible that Karen actually had the authority she claimed to have? But every time they thought about it, the more ridiculous it seemed. It just didn't make sense that an HOA could demand access to someone's private property without permission or proper notification, and yet Karen had acted as though that was exactly what she was entitled to do. When the time came for the consultation, the protagonist met with a lawyer, a calm and professional individual who listened intently as the protagonist explained the situation. After recounting the details, the lawyer nodded thoughtfully and then asked a few clarifying questions to make sure they had all the facts. The lawyer explained that Karen had absolutely no legal grounds to demand access to the protagonist's driveway without proper notice or consent. The lawyer emphasized that even though the HOA had certain rights within the community, those rights did not extend to private property unless specific procedures had been followed. The protagonist felt a wave of relief wash over them as they heard the lawyer confirm what they had hoped for. Karen was not in the right, and the protagonist had the law on their side. With the consultation complete, the protagonist felt more empowered than ever. They now had the knowledge they needed to confront Karen and ensure she wouldn't pull the same stunt again. The legal advice had given them the confidence to stand firm and not let Karen walk all over them. But the real challenge was still ahead. They had to face Karen again and make it clear that they knew their rights. The next morning, the protagonist woke up with a renewed sense of determination. They knew that confronting Karen wasn't going to be easy, but they felt confident that they could stand their ground. Now that they understood the law and their rights, it was time to make it clear to Karen that her demands were not only unreasonable but also illegal. The protagonist spent the next few hours preparing mentally for the confrontation. They knew Karen would likely be stubborn and could try to intimidate them with her usual overbearing attitude, but they were ready this time. They weren't just going to let her walk all over them. Around noon, the protagonist spotted Karen walking down the street, clipboard in hand, As she made her rounds through the neighborhood, checking for violations as usual, the protagonist took a deep breath and stepped outside the door. They walked across the yard and stood on the front porch waiting for Karen to approach. As Karen got closer, she saw the protagonist standing there with a serious expression on their face. She immediately slowed her pace and gave a small but knowing smile, as though she expected this kind of interaction to happen at some point today. She had probably assumed the protagonist would cave in, but little did she know they were prepared for her. This time Karen walked up the driveway and stopped in front of the protagonist with her usual air of authority. "I hope you've had some time to think about what we discussed yesterday," Karen said, her voice dripping with condescension. The protagonist held their ground and replied calmly, "Actually, I've had plenty of time to think about it, and I've also had a chance to consult with a lawyer." Karen's smile faltered slightly as the words sunk in. She was used to getting her way and intimidating people into submission, but this time something was different. The protagonist continued, "The lawyer confirmed that the HOA doesn't have the legal right to demand access to my property without proper notice or consent, and that includes my driveway." Karen's face shifted from mild surprise to irritation. She clearly hadn't expected the protagonist to take such a firm stand. "That's not how it works," Karen snapped, trying to regain her composure. "The HOA has the authority to make decisions for the community, and that includes access to private property for improvements," she said, trying to sound authoritative. The protagonist remained calm but firm. "That's not true, Karen. The HOA doesn't have carte blanche to do whatever it wants without following proper procedures. I'm well within my rights to refuse access to my property unless the proper steps are taken." Karen's face reddened with frustration, but she wasn't ready to back down just yet. She took a step closer to the protagonist, as if to intimidate them into submission, but the protagonist didn't flinch. "You can call the HOA all you want," the protagonist continued, "but I'm not allowing anyone on my property without proper documentation and advance notice." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the protagonist quickly added, "And if you continue to push this, I will have no choice but to take legal action to protect my rights." Karen's eyes narrowed as she studied the protagonist's face for any sign of weakness, but she saw none. For a long moment, Karen said nothing. She stood there glaring at the protagonist, as though trying to figure out how to regain control of the situation. But the protagonist had all the cards now. Karen was not used to being challenged in this way, and it was clear that the tables had turned. Karen finally took a deep breath and backed away slightly. Her posture stiffened as if trying to reassert some semblance of authority. But the damage had been done. The protagonist knew they had won this round. Karen wasn't about to admit defeat so easily, but she had been forced to acknowledge that she was in the wrong for the first time in a long while. She had been put in her place. "I'll be reporting this to the HOA," Karen muttered under her breath as she turned to walk away, but the protagonist wasn't concerned. They had already taken the necessary steps and knew that Karen's threats carried no weight any longer. With the legal advice in hand, they had the upper hand, and Karen couldn't change that. The protagonist stood there watching as Karen walked down the street, her head held high, but her defeat unmistakable. For the first time, the protagonist felt truly empowered. They had stood up to Karen and protected their rights, and that victory felt better than anything else. The next few days felt like a strange mix of relief and anticipation for the protagonist. They had confronted Karen and won, but they knew that wasn't the end of the story. Karen didn't take well to defeat, and it was only a matter of time before she tried something else to assert her control over the neighborhood. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that Karen would find another way to make their life difficult, so they decided to prepare for whatever might come next. At the same time, they also felt a sense of pride knowing they had stood their ground, they had defended their rights and not backed down in the face of intimidation, and they weren't going to let Karen or the HOA walk all over them. A few days later, the protagonist received a letter in the mail. It was from the HOA office, and at first glance it looked like the usual quarterly newsletter about community events. But when they opened it and read the first few lines, their hearts sank. It was a formal notice about an upcoming HOA meeting that was being called to address property access disputes. With the protagonist's address listed as one of the key issues to be discussed, the letter was vague, but the message was clear. Karen had taken their confrontation to the next level, and now the HOA was involved. This wasn't just about a driveway anymore. This was about a personal vendetta, and it looked like the HOA was ready to back her up. The protagonist's mind raced. They had won the battle with Karen, but it seemed like the war was far from over. After the initial shock wore off, the protagonist decided they needed to take immediate action. They couldn't just sit back and wait for the HOA to make its move. This was an opportunity to make sure they had the full support of their legal team. Before the meeting took place, they immediately called their lawyer and explained the situation. The lawyer listened carefully and then assured them that this kind of retaliation from the HOA wasn't uncommon, but that didn't make it right. The lawyer advised the protagonist to attend the meeting with their legal team present to ensure that their rights were protected and that no one could bully them into agreeing to anything they weren't comfortable with. The protagonist took a deep breath and agreed they would be ready for whatever came next. They weren't about to let Karen or the HOA push them around. The day of the meeting arrived, and the protagonist felt a mix of nerves and determination. As they walked into the HOA office, they had never been to one of these meetings before, but they knew this was going to be different. The usual group of HOA members were gathered in the room, and at the front sat Karen with her arms crossed and a smug look on her face. She seemed to be relishing the idea of finally getting her way with the protagonist, but little did she know the protagonist wasn't going to let her win this time. The protagonist sat down at the table and scanned the room, noticing the other neighbors who had been invited to attend. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed curious, but none of them looked like they were ready to get involved in the dispute. The protagonist felt their resolve harden. The meeting began, and Karen immediately took the floor as though she were the one in charge. She started outlining her version of the events, twisting the facts to make it sound like the protagonist had been unreasonable and obstructive. She made it seem like the HOA's request for access to the driveway was perfectly reasonable and that the protagonist had overreacted by refusing. But the protagonist wasn't going to let her get away with it. This time, with a calm voice and clear conviction, the protagonist stood up and addressed the room. "I'd like to make it clear that I fully respect the HOA's role in the community, but I will not allow my rights to be violated by anyone, not even the HOA." They began their statement while looking directly at Karen, who now looked visibly uncomfortable. As the protagonist continued, they explained how they had consulted with their lawyer and how Karen had overstepped by demanding access to private property without following the proper legal procedures. They could see the other neighbors listening intently, and the tone of the room began to shift from one of suspicion to one of support. Karen tried to interrupt, but the protagonist calmly raised a hand and continued laying out the facts and the legal reasoning behind their refusal to let the HOA take action without following the proper steps. The room grew silent as the protagonists spoke their piece, and when they finished, they sat back down, feeling a sense of satisfaction, knowing they had made their case clearly and decisively. Karen's smug expression was replaced with one of frustration as she fumbled for words. She had clearly expected this to be an easy victory, but now the tide was turning, and Karen was beginning to realize that she had underestimated the protagonist's resolve. The silence in the room was thick as the protagonist sat back down at the table, their words still hanging in the air like a weight. Karen was glaring at them, her face flushed with frustration, but she was struggling to find anything to say to counter the well-prepared argument that the protagonist had just laid out. The other members of the HOA were looking back and forth between the protagonist and Karen, unsure of how to react. It was clear that the room was beginning to shift in favor of the protagonist, and Karen knew it. She wasn't used to being challenged in this way, especially not in front of the other HOA members. Her usual tactics of intimidation weren't working this time. Karen shifted in her seat, her hands gripping the edge of the table. As she tried to regain some semblance of control, she cleared her throat and stood up, ready to launch into another tirade. But before she could speak, one of the other neighbors who had been listening to the conversation raised their hand. The neighbor, a middle aged man named Greg, was someone the protagonist had spoken to briefly. In passing, he was known for being reasonable and fair minded, but not someone who typically got involved in HOA drama. Still, he had clearly been paying attention to the exchange, and his next words caught everyone off guard. "I think what the protagonist is saying makes sense," Greg said, looking around the room. "I've been here long enough to know that the HOA can't just walk all over people's rights, and if they've consulted with a lawyer, it sounds like they're on solid ground." The room fell quiet again, and everyone's eyes turned to Greg, who was now speaking with a quiet but firm authority. Karen's face twisted in irritation, but she didn't interrupt. Greg continued, "If the HOA is going to push for something like this, it needs to be done the right way. If it's not, we risk setting a dangerous precedent for the rest of the community." His words were simple but powerful, and they carried weight with the group. The other neighbors were nodding in agreement, some of them clearly uncomfortable with Karen's behavior, but not knowing how to voice their concerns until now. Now that Greg had spoken up, they seemed more willing to follow his lead. Karen's face was turning redder by the second, and she quickly tried to regain control of the conversation. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice rising slightly. "We are simply trying to make improvements to the neighborhood, and this individual refuses to cooperate. It's disruptive and against the spirit of community." But Karen's words were losing their power. The more she spoke, the more people seemed to tune her out and pay attention to the protagonist and Greg. Instead, the atmosphere in the room was changing. The tension that had been there before was slowly dissipating as more and more people began to support the protagonist's position. The protagonist could see the shift in the room and felt their confidence growing with each passing moment. They had never been a fan of confrontation, but standing up to Karen had shown them just how much power they had when they were informed and prepared. They took a deep breath and stood up again. This time their voice was calm but firm. "I understand that improvements are important for the neighborhood," they said, addressing the room. "But those improvements need to be done fairly and legally. They can't be imposed on individuals without due process." The protagonist's eyes locked with Karen's for a moment before they continued, "I'm not against progress, I'm against being steamrolled by someone who thinks they can force their will on others because they think they're in charge." The words hung in the air, and this time Karen didn't try to argue back. She simply stared at the protagonist with a mixture of disbelief and simmering anger. It was clear that Karen was losing this battle, and as the meeting continued, it became more and more apparent that the support was shifting in the protagonist's favor. The HOA members, who had previously been hesitant to speak up, were now asking more questions about the legal aspects of the situation and showing concern about overstepping their authority. Karen tried to rally them, but the tide had already turned. It wasn't long before the meeting adjourned, and the group disbanded with the issue still unresolved. But with the protagonist's position clearly understood, Karen had been put in her place, and the protagonist had not only defended their rights, but had also gained the support of at least some of the neighbors. As the room emptied and the protagonist made their way to the door, they could feel a sense of victory building within them. They had stood up to Karen and the HOA and come out on top. For now, the battle was won. But they knew that Karen wasn't one to give up easily. They'd have to be prepared for whatever she tried next. But for the first time in a long while, the protagonist felt ready to face whatever came their way. The next few days after the HOA meeting were tense but strangely calm. Karen had been unusually quiet, and the protagonist found themselves constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. They had expected a barrage of angry emails or a late-night knock on the door, but there was nothing for a while. It was almost as if Karen had retreated into the shadows, licking her wounds and recalibrating for the next round. It wasn't that the protagonist was ungrateful for the quiet, it was just that it felt unnerving after everything that had happened. The silence almost seemed too perfect, as if the calm before the storm was about to hit at any moment. During this time, the protagonist took the opportunity to strengthen their position. They reached out to more neighbors and started talking about the HOA issues openly at the local coffee shop, getting people to voice their opinions about Karen's behavior and the HOA's overreach, it became clear that a number of neighbors were quietly in support of the protagonist. Though they hadn't spoken up at the meeting, they were starting to see how Karen's actions weren't just a one-off, and that the HOA could be too controlling when given the chance. The protagonist didn't want to start a war with everyone in the neighborhood, but they did want to make sure that the truth about Karen and her manipulation wasn't ignored anymore. So they began building a network of allies who might be willing to back them up if the situation escalated again. But despite their best efforts to stay one step ahead, the protagonist still couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. They couldn't let their guard down, and they knew that if Karen was going to make her next move, it would come with all the subtlety of a freight train. Sure enough, one evening a letter arrived. It was addressed in the familiar formal style of the HOA office, and the protagonist's heart sank as they opened it. They had hoped for peace, but the letter made it clear that Karen had once again rallied the HOA board, this time for something far more serious. The letter was a formal request for a vote to re-evaluate the driveway issue and to potentially fine the protagonist for obstruction of HOA efforts. The wording was vague, but the intent was clear. Karen wasn't done yet, and this time she had her sights set on financially punishing the protagonist for standing up to her. The protagonist's mind raced as they read through the letter. The fine wasn't enormous, but it didn't matter. It was the principle of the thing. Karen was going to keep fighting, and now the HOA was using its authority to try and punish the protagonist for something that was entirely legal and justified. They felt a sort of frustration, but also determination. They weren't going to let this slide, and they weren't going to back down this time. They immediately called their lawyer and explained the situation once again. The lawyer reassured them that Karen's move was likely an act of desperation and that the HOA couldn't impose fines without proper justification. They explained that the HOA would need to follow specific legal procedures to levy any fines, and that the protagonist was still well within their rights to refuse access to their driveway unless everything was handled correctly. The protagonist knew what they had to do. They needed to show up at the next HOA meeting and make it clear that Karen's petty retaliation wasn't going to succeed this time. They weren't just going to sit back and let Karen play her game without consequences. The protagonist worked with their lawyer to prepare a solid defense and gather more evidence to support their position. They even spoke with a few neighbors who had witnessed Karen's overreach and were now willing to testify on the protagonist's behalf if needed. The day of the meeting came quickly, and this time the protagonist was ready. They arrived early to ensure they were prepared to speak and present their case properly. They knew that if they could get the majority of the neighborhood behind them, they could stop Karen once and for all. As the meeting began, Karen wasted no time launching into her usual tirade about how the protagonist was obstructing progress and harming the community. She made sure to emphasize the fine as a way to hold the protagonist accountable for their misdeeds. But this time the protagonist stood up before she could finish and with calm confidence addressed the room. They explained that the HOA was not above the law and that Karen's attempt to impose fines without proper procedure was not only illegal but also harmful to the community. They emphasized that they had already consulted with a lawyer and had clear legal backing for their position, and that they were prepared to take action if the HOA continued down this path. The other members of the board were listening now, and there was a noticeable shift in the room as the protagonist laid out their case in a clear and respectful manner. One by one, the members started to look uneasy about Karen's actions, and the support for the protagonist's position seemed to grow. Karen looked livid, but her words faltered as the room started to turn against her, and in that moment the protagonist realized that this battle wasn't just about their driveway anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about standing up for what was right and protecting the community from someone who believed they could get away with anything just because they had a title, and the protagonist wasn't going to let that happen again. The tension in the room was palpable as the protagonist stood their ground. Karen's face had shifted from the usual smug confidence to something darker. It was clear she hadn't expected this much resistance, especially not from the neighbors and the other HOA members. Her posture was rigid, her eyes darting around the room as if trying to find a way to regain control. But the more she tried to speak, the more the room shifted in the protagonist's favor. The protagonist's calm demeanor and clear legal argument were making an impact, and Karen could feel the tide turning against her. The HOA members began exchanging looks. Many of them seemed uncomfortable with how Karen had been handling the situation, and now that the protagonist had presented their case with such clarity, they were beginning to see things differently. Some of the members even looked like they were reconsidering their positions on the issue. They weren't quick to take sides, but it was clear that they weren't willing to just blindly follow Karen's lead anymore. One member even raised a hand to ask a question to Karen. Karen, do you have the proper documentation to support the fine? The question was direct and pointed, and for the first time in the meeting, Karen hesitated. Her usual confident demeanor cracked, and she seemed unprepared for the inquiry. Karen tried to brush it off with a wave of her hand. The fine is standard procedure, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The member who had asked the question was clearly not satisfied, and neither were the others. As the silence hung in the air, the protagonist seized the opportunity to speak up again. I've consulted with my lawyer, and we've already verified that the HOA doesn't have the authority to impose this fine without proper documentation and a clear process. If Karen is claiming otherwise, she's either misinformed or willfully ignoring the law. Their words were firm, but measured as they made their case. Once again, Karen's face twisted with frustration, and she opened her mouth to speak, but was cut off by another HOA member who had clearly had enough. I think we need to take a step back and evaluate this properly, the member said. We don't want to set a precedent where we allow fines to be levied without clear evidence and legal procedures. That was it, the final blow. Karen had no more allies in the room, and the support for the protagonist was overwhelming. Even some of the quieter members who had been on the fence now nodded in agreement. Karen's face went pale as she realized the game was up. The protagonist had not only defended their own rights, but had managed to rally enough support to sway the meeting entirely. Karen opened her mouth as if to protest, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The decision was clear. The HOA members voted unanimously to dismiss the fine and to remind Karen that proper procedures had to be followed if any future actions were to be taken. The protagonist felt a wave of triumph wash over them as they watched Karen's face twist in disbelief. She had lost this round, and she knew it. As the meeting adjourned, the protagonist stood tall. As they walked out of the room, they could feel the weight of the victory settle in, and while they knew this wasn't necessarily the end of Karen's antics, they also knew that they had made a statement. The HOA could no longer be used as a tool for personal vendettas, and they had made it clear that standing up for one's rights wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something to be proud of. The neighbors who had supported them now felt emboldened to speak up more, and the protagonist had earned a newfound respect in the community, not just for defending themselves, but for standing up for what was right. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood felt different. The air had cleared in a way the protagonist hadn't expected. There were no more whispers of fear or discomfort. When Karen's name was mentioned, people were talking openly about the issues, and even though there was still some tension, the protagonist felt a shift in the atmosphere. They had done more than win a legal battle. They had inspired change in the community. They were no longer just the quiet neighbor trying to keep to themselves. They had found their voice, and it had made a difference. Karen, however, was not so quick to accept defeat as the protagonist had suspected. She tried to turn a few neighbors against them, but her efforts were half-hearted and lacked the conviction they once had. It was clear that her power had been diminished, and with every failed attempt to reignite the conflict, Karen's influence in the neighborhood began to wane slowly. But surely she found herself isolated, and without the support she had once enjoyed. The protagonist continued to live their life in peace, knowing that they had done what was necessary to protect their rights and the integrity of the neighborhood, and though they knew that challenges might still arise, they were confident that they had the strength to face whatever came next with their head held high. As the weeks passed, the protagonist found that their life had returned to a sense of normalcy, but it wasn't the same normal they had once known. It was a new normal, one where they walked through the neighborhood with a quiet confidence, knowing that they had stood up for what was right and that they had made a lasting impact on the community. The sense of relief that came from no longer fearing Karen's constant demands was immense, but there was also a lingering awareness that peace in this neighborhood was fragile and that any shift in dynamics could tip the balance again. The protagonist took comfort in the fact that they had allies now. The neighbors who had supported them during the HOA battle had formed a loose network of like-minded individuals who were willing to stand up for fairness and community integrity. They had quietly promised each other to look out for one another and to never let anyone use the HOA or their position to bully others. Again, it was a small but powerful shift in the neighborhood's culture, one that brought the protagonist a sense of belonging they had never felt before. The days were quieter now, but they knew they had played a role in helping shift the power dynamics in the community for the better. Karen, on the other hand, had begun to fade into the background. Her usual authoritative presence was gone. She no longer strutted down the streets with a clipboard or held court at neighborhood gatherings. Instead, she seemed smaller, somehow her influence shattered by the very people she had once sought to control. The protagonist could see her now from time to time, but Karen's eyes no longer held the same venomous glare that they once had. Instead, they were filled with a mixture of resentment and defeat. It was clear that her role in the neighborhood had been diminished, but the protagonist couldn't feel sorry for her. Karen had made her bed, and now she was forced to lie in it. Despite the peace that had settled over the neighborhood, the protagonist stayed vigilant. They knew that as long as Karen remained in the neighborhood, there would always be the potential for more conflict. While Karen was defeated for now, the protagonist understood that people like her didn't change easily, and it was possible she would try again at some point. They were ready for that eventuality, though they knew how to navigate the system, now how to stand up for themselves without being intimidated into submission. But they were also aware that they didn't want to live in a constant state of defense, so they made the decision to continue to nurture the positive changes that had come from the HOA fight. They started hosting informal gatherings in the neighborhood, welcoming new residents, and encouraging open dialogue between the neighbors. They knew that creating an environment of mutual respect and understanding would ensure that the community stayed united and strong. As the protagonist helped organize a block party one warm evening, they could see how different things had become. There was a new sense of camaraderie among the neighbors, and even Karen was forced to acknowledge that the community had changed in ways that she could no longer control. People smiled and greeted each other openly, and the protagonist felt a sense of pride watching the neighbors come together to celebrate the neighborhood's strength and resilience. They had stood up to Karen, and in doing so had brought the entire community closer together. Of course, Karen had no intention of attending the block party. She would have rather stayed home sulking and muttering about the injustices she felt had been done to her. But as the protagonist watched everyone else enjoying the festivities, they couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. They had fought for something bigger than just their driveway. They had fought for a sense of fairness and equality in a neighborhood where some had tried to use power to divide people into factions, and where others had been afraid to speak up. They had set an example that even in the face of adversity, it was possible to stand firm and change the direction of the community for the better. The party was a resounding success, and the protagonist felt a deep sense of gratitude for the support of the neighbors who had stood by them throughout the entire ordeal. They knew that it wasn't just about winning a fight against Karen, but about creating a space where people felt empowered to stand up for what was right and to build a community where everyone had a voice. As the night wore on and the laughter and music continued, the protagonist looked around and realized that the real victory wasn't the legal battles or the confrontations. It was the fact that the neighborhood had come together and become stronger for it. They had taken a stand, and the community had rallied behind them, turning a difficult situation into an opportunity for growth and unity. It was in this moment of peace that the protagonist understood the true power of standing up for what's right. It wasn't about defeating one person, it was about building something lasting and meaningful, and they knew that they had made a difference in a way that would ripple through the community for years to come. Months passed, and the protagonist watched as the neighborhood continued to thrive in a way they hadn't seen before. The sense of unity and mutual respect had become a new normal, and it felt like a weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. Even the more hesitant neighbors, who had once stayed quiet, now spoke up in meetings and shared their opinions freely. It was clear that the atmosphere had shifted from one of fear and submission to one of openness and collaboration, and the protagonist couldn't help but feel proud of what they had helped to create. They had done more than win a battle, they had sparked a movement within the neighborhood, one that encouraged everyone to have a voice and to stand up for what was right. Karen had become a shadow of her former self. She rarely left her house, and when she did, the once commanding presence she had was now nowhere to be seen. People still spoke of her, but it was no longer with the same fear or respect they had once given her. Instead, she was the subject of quiet whispers and sideways glances. At first, she tried to stir up trouble again, reaching out to the HOA and other neighbors in an attempt to regain control, but her efforts were met with indifference and even disdain from those who had once followed her lead. It became increasingly clear that Karen had lost her influence and had been relegated to the sidelines of the neighborhood drama she had once thrived in. The protagonist knew that Karen wouldn't give up completely, though they could feel the occasional tension whenever their paths crossed. But they were no longer afraid of what she could do. They had already proven their point and stood up for what they believed in, and they were ready for whatever came next. Even if Karen tried to stir things up again, the protagonist knew how to handle it. They had learned how to protect their rights and how to fight for the integrity of their community, and they were no longer intimidated by Karen or anyone else who sought to undermine the peace they had worked so hard to create. The protagonist had become a quiet leader in the neighborhood, not through force or confrontation, but through consistency and fairness. They had shown everyone that standing up for what was right didn't have to be about aggression or winning at all costs. It was about standing firm in the face of injustice and fighting for the well-being of their entire community. They had earned the respect of their neighbors, not through dominance, but through their actions and their unwavering commitment to fairness. Life in the neighborhood continued to improve, and the protagonist took an active role in organizing more community events, bringing people together to work on projects that benefited everyone, whether it was a neighborhood cleanup or a charity drive. The sense of collective purpose grew stronger with each passing month. The protagonist felt a deep sense of fulfillment in these moments, knowing that their efforts had led to something bigger than themselves, something that would endure long after the dust had settled from their confrontation with Karen. Karen's name was rarely spoken anymore, but the protagonist knew that the changes they had brought to the neighborhood would last far longer than any conflict with one individual could ever have. They had done what so many others had been afraid to do, and in doing so had paved the way for a community that valued cooperation over division, respect over fear, and fairness over manipulation. The protagonist didn't need recognition or accolades. They had already won the most important victory of all. They had created a place where everyone had the opportunity to be heard, and where the power dynamics that once ruled the neighborhood had been toppled for good. As the years went by, the protagonist's legacy lived on in the neighborhood. It wasn't just about the legal victories or the battles won, it was about the lasting change. They had helped to foster a community that had learned to speak up for itself, to value its rights, and to protect the integrity of its shared spaces. It was a place where people didn't just coexist, but worked together to build something stronger and more meaningful. And the protagonist could look around and feel a deep sense of pride, knowing that they had been a part of that transformation. They had fought for fairness, they had stood up for themselves and others, and in doing so had helped create a better future for everyone in the neighborhood. The victory wasn't just theirs, it was the community's.